The presenters for the last session for today are George Hayes and Judy Aleo, who actually transcribed the journal of Daniel Howell Heiss, also known as Pat's Diary. And you may access the entire diary either on the library's webpage, the Salem Public Library. We also have a hard copy of it here, and we do have the original diary that was transcribed. So it's a wonderful resource, lots of great information, and when you're researching local topics, it is searchable so that you can look for references to various things that you're trying to find. I have a copy on my laptop, and I use it all the time. Thank you, Judy and George. Very helpful. And just a reminder, tomorrow we have sessions all afternoon. There is an Underground Railroad tour, if you haven't taken that yet, at 1:15 p.m. And there are sessions at 1:15, 2, 3, and 4 tomorrow afternoon. And we have a schedule if you'd like to see that. So invite lots of people to come by because we have some great speakers tomorrow. We have Jan Sanhorn Lane, who wrote Safe Houses on the Underground Railroad in Northeast Ohio. And we also have Paul Hobie doing another journal. He'll be sharing excerpts from Polly's journal, which was written by a woman in North Benton during the Civil War. So.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes. Good afternoon.
We're so pleased to share this beautiful, true story with you this afternoon. It is the story of a remarkable man and his life in Salem during the 1800s. It is a story worth telling and comes from the carefully kept journals of an extraordinary man by the name of Daniel Howell Heiss.
Production of the Heiss Diary has been a work in progress for more than a century. Daniel Howell Heiss began writing his journal in 1846 and continued to record daily entries until the morning of his death in 1878. The journals are being carefully preserved by the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus. Victor Wood, a member of the Salem Historical Society, began transcribing the journals from microfilm into digital form. Judy Aleo took over and continued transcribing from microfilm copies as well as the digitized form. And on the task of final editing, she also transcribed an additional 4 years of journal entries made by Heiss's nephew and later his son-in-law, Edwin, who continued the journal following Daniel's death, providing a 36-year record of life in Salem.
Daniel Howell Heiss was a red-headed, red-bearded human dynamo who kept a journal. For 32 years, from 1846 to 1878, he kept a daily journal recording important events and happenings in Salem, where valuable early history of our town was included. Born in New Jersey in 1813, Daniel moved to Salem when he was 6. He married Margaret Goldborn in 1839, and they were the parents of 2 daughters. In 1857, they moved from a house approximately the site of the Salem Public Library and the Memorial Building to Unserhiem, the Queen Anne-style farmhouse his father built out on the Franklin Road. Daniel was a jack of many trades, working in construction, blacksmithing, roofing, carpentry, and farming. He applied for and received patents for many of the tools that he crafted. He also owned and operated a sawmill and a brick kiln on the site of the present Riley Stadium. Daniel was very serious when it came to his business dealings. He paid his debts promptly and expected others to do the same. Daniel was an extrovert, and his home was always overflowing with visitors, including such prominent people as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth. Daniel was also an ardent abolitionist, agreeing closely with the views of William Lloyd Garrison that slavery was a sin and had to be abolished immediately, not gradually.
Margaret Heiss attended local women's rights meetings, and Daniel fully supported her because he believed it was the right of women to have greater participation in government affairs. According to his journal, when Salem hosted the 1850s Women's Rights Convention, Daniel was in attendance in support of his wife.
He recorded in his journal on April 18, 1850,
Betsy Cowles, Mrs. Whiting, Mrs. Griffin, Mrs. Woodworth, and one other lady took supper with us this evening. They have come to attend the Women's Convention that goes off tomorrow.
and on April 19, 1850, the day of the Women's Rights Convention held in Salem, Daniel wrote,
The Women's Convention was a perfect jam, all enthusiasm. They did honor to their sex. Cursed by the pitiful whining politicians that still persist in withholding her from her political rights.
Over the years, much progress and development came to Salem, and Daniel resolutely recorded it all. He wrote of Salem being lit with gas for the first time, the ringing of the first church bell, the planking of roads, and the coming of the railroad. Today, a modest granite stone marks the graves of Daniel and Margaret at Hope Cemetery in Salem. Daniel truly loved his beloved wife of 39 years, Margaret Goulbourne Heiss. He wrote in his journal on July 3, 1849,
This evening is the anniversary of our marriage. 10 years have passed since the knot of matrimony was tied between us. I still bless the day that joined us.
And on December 11, 1852,
Margaret, Sis, and Mother Heiss has gone to Canfield and not coming back today, and I'm here alone with the exception of William Smith. He and I played checkers, soon after which we retired, I to my lonely pillow and he to his. Had a lonesome time of it last night.
and July 4, 1870,
This is the 31st anniversary of our marriage, which took place on the evening of July 3, 1839. We have neither of us ever regretted it. It has been 31 years of work and buffeting of this world's ups and downs, but we have thus far been able to secure a comfortable home, and if nothing happens, will at our deaths have something to divide between our two dear children, whose comfort it is the height of my ambition to secure.
Daniel's firstborn was named Mary Ann and affectionately nicknamed Sis. Daniel cared deeply for his elder daughter. He wrote on September 23, 1851,
Bought Sis a beautiful toy for 25 cents. She is happy with her toys.
and July 2, 1873,
Sis and Ed went to Pennsylvania to get married, returned about 8 o'clock this evening, and went directly to their own house to spend the night, having everything in ample order to go at once to keeping house.
1 year later, July 5, 1874,
I am hailed as grandfather for the first time, Sis having given birth to a daughter about 5 o'clock this morning. Am rejoiced to know she got along so well.
February 28, 1875,
Ed and Sis came up and brought little Margaret, of which I am very glad. She is so sweet and interesting to me. She grows finely.
March 8, 1875,
Baby slept poorly last night. Strange place or something else the matter. First time she ever slept at Grandpapa's.
Later that year, in December of 1875, little Margaret died unexpectedly. Her death left behind a grief-stricken family and affected the physical well-being of Sis. Facing the death of his beloved granddaughter was one of the most difficult moments in Daniel's life. He sums up his feelings and emotion in just one very poignant quote. He wrote on December 22, 1875,
Arrived at home on time, where I found our family well, but sad enough, which was soon accounted for by the announcement of the sudden death of my dear little granddaughter at 11 o'clock last night. How can I reconcile myself to the loss? She was so precious and beloved by us all, was so intelligent, playful, and interesting, had become so endeared to me that I now feel unable to part with her. But death is inexorable. No anguishing heart or sympathizing can stay his relentless hand. Knowing this, it becomes me to bear and not repine. I must now go down to Daughters and comfort her all I can. But there is no armor against fate early or late. We must all pale captives yield to death. Went down to see little pet. She is beautiful in death. Did not stay long. Could not.
Daniel and Margaret had another daughter born 20 years after Mary Ann, and it was quite evident that Nora was a welcome addition and a much-loved little girl. Daniel wrote on December 1st, 1862,
Rained some in the night. At 2:00 a.m. I was asked by Margaret to call in some of our female neighbors to her assistance. What took place it is unnecessary to record, save that our household was added a member of the gentle sex. All passed off well, for which I am duly and truly thankful.
December 1st, 1863.
Today our dear little Nora is 1 year old. God bless her, how I dote on her in everything.
January 6, 1867.
Margaret and I visited at Harriet Ames. Came home in violent snowstorm. Little Nora stood in the sleigh amidst it all and seemed to enjoy it much.
Daniel held a soft spot in his heart for all children, and in particular his little nephew, Willie Waite, the 4-year-old son of his sister Elizabeth. He wrote in late December of 1861,
Margaret is up at Sister Lizzie's. Her son Willie is sick with sore throat. Willie is no better. No prospect of getting well. I am disconsolate in consequence. Spent a part of the evening with Willie. Left him at 8 o'clock sitting on his mother's lap.
The next day, January 1st, 1862,
Went to town about 9 o'clock, but learned on the way that dear little Willie was dead, having died about an hour after I left. He was an uncommon bright child for one of his age. I was passionately fond of him. We liked each other's company very much, and I have had no greater struggle to give anyone up. There will always be a bright spot in the path where he and I played on the road through life. Peace to thee, Willie. Thou hast by thy early departure escaped a world of trouble.
January 2nd, 1862.
Attended the funeral of little Willie. He was by far the prettiest corpse I ever saw. He was beautifully dressed and his coffin lined and cushioned with white satin. He deserved it all. It was a sad duty to consign one so lovely to the grave.
Just 3 weeks later, Willie's little brother Otis also died of diphtheria. Their father, absent in Kentucky as master of transportation in Sherman's brigade, would not hear of his death for a week to come. Daniel's home was named Unserhiem, meaning our home. This beautiful Queen Anne-style home is located at 1100 Franklin Avenue. The stone wall that still lines the driveway was built from stone quarried on the site. From old photographs, we know that Unserhiem originally had 3 gables. One was removed at some point following Daniel's death. Daniel talks and tells about his move to the home, originally built by his father Aaron and later remodeled and expanded by Daniel. He wrote on February 15, 1857,
"We are packing up our goods to make one more move, so that this is perhaps the last Sunday that I shall ever spend as a citizen in the borough of Salem, where I have lived for the last 38 years.
February 17, 1857.
Clear and warm, got possession of Unserhiem this morning. Spent the day in fixing up. George Heiss and Phoebe Henselwood helped us.
October 14, 1859.
Carpenters raised some more of our house. I am now ashamed of having built so large, and had no idea it would look so extravagantly large as it does."
A Salem News article dated 1909 expressed the grandeur of Daniel's home. It read,
In its day, the Heiss homestead was the model residence structure of this part of the country, people traveling many miles to view and inspect the home.
One cannot read Daniel's journal without understanding the importance of the railroad and how it forever changed life in Salem in the mid-19th century. He wrote in November of 1851,
Heard the whistle of the locomotive for the first time in Salem. I went out to the railroad and saw them laying the iron down. The locomotive passed the West Road this afternoon for the first time. Tomorrow she can get to the station.
And on January 6, 1852,
The railroad connection between here and Pittsburgh was made today. The track layers worked all night last night and made the connection precisely at 12 o'clock p.m. 2 Pittsburgh locomotives were waiting the driving of the last spike, which was no sooner done than all hands jumped aboard and came to Salem, at which place they arrived at 1:30.
Daniel made many friends during his lifetime. One friend in particular, however, was mentioned with affection over and over again in his journals. That man was Joel McMillan. Joel and his family lived just down the road from Daniel, and he tells of them often partaking of supper and feasting on strawberries and cream, and of singing and of dancing. They very often loaned each other money, and later entries reflect the faithful repayment of those loans. They helped each other mending fences, felling trees, hauling wood and stone. They exchanged hired hands to help husk corn and to butcher. They sat at each other's bedsides during times of illness. Those dear friends were there for each other in good times and in bad, and you need only read those journal entries to feel the true bond of friendship that they once shared. Daniel built the building that was to become home to McMillan's bookstore, especially for his old friend Joel McMillan. It was one of the 3 storefronts in the Trinity Block, which still stands today. The Trinity Block later became home to Sincerely Yours gift, Elizabeth Renee's Bridal, and the law office of attorney Frederick E. Narrigan. It was attorney Narrigan's portion that was originally home to McMillan's bookstore. Daniel wrote in November and December of 1873,
The floors are all down. Roof nearly finished. I ripped out walnut for countertop and painted tin roof. Galvanized cornice is being put up. It will look magnificent.
And in January of 1874,
I spent the day working at the closet under the stairway. Plasters are lathing room number 2. Set a grate in building. Done it as well as the best of them. Joel got his front in. It is charming.
in early March of 1874,
Frank hauled dirt from the street in front of the new building. I done what I could. Got some of the countertop glued on. Making a splendid job, but costing like blazes. Put in front glass. All is now complete. Everyone is congratulating me on having so handsome a building.
in mid-March of 1874, he wrote,
I worked at iron door for front stairway of Trinity Block to keep the fellows from running up at night. Got all the stone laid that we have. Got the best pavement in Salem by a long ways. hauled over the big stone out of Broadway with 3 horses.
In April 16th and 17th of 1874.
Bought 2-inch round iron, and Brother Jesse helped me make it into 5 hitching posts. In the evening, had oyster supper at Macmillan's bookstore, given by Joel to the town council that vacated the alley on which we built his 6.5 feet of the rest of the east side of his storeroom.
Daniel was a caring and faithful friend and was at Joel's bedside when he drew his last breath on August 15, 1877. 3 days later, Daniel wrote,
Devoted the day to Joel Macmillan's funeral, hauled a load of boards for seats, and got the neighbors to bring chairs. At the appointed hour, a large number of friends assembled to perform the last sad rites. Abby Whitney, Fanny Heiss, John Clemens, and Henry Hawley sang, and oh, how beautiful it was, both at the house and at the cemetery. 104 carriages formed in procession, besides a number that did not go to the cemetery.
What a pivotal time it was in America as the issue of slavery smoldered, consequently adding to the steady unrest between the North and the South, and ultimately resulting in a civil war. The surge of slaves fleeing from the Deep South to Canada and freedom traveled by way of an underground railroad. Daniel was a vital link to the Salem stop of that underground activity. He lived to see slavery abolished, but not before opening his home to hundreds of unfortunate beings on their flight to freedom. Though not mentioned in any detail in any of his journal entries, we know there was a tunnel connecting the barn to the hidden rooms in both the basement and attic of Unserhiem. He purposely did not include details in order to protect the abolitionists and slaves in the event his journals ended up in the wrong hands.
Scores of runaway slaves found refuge and hiding places in the cellar and attic of the house, and in a secret room under a ramp to the barn. Daniel brought them to Unserhiem, where that tunnel enabled the slaves to move from the barn to the house undetected. After resting during the day, they were transported in the false bottom of a farm wagon to homes out in the country, where they could continue their journey to freedom.
The barn was torn down sometime after the turn of the century. At that time, a good-sized room was discovered in the embankment under the built-up ramp. That room had a cement floor and plastered walls and could only be entered through a small door in the barn itself. The tunnel ran to the basement of the house. It is said that when it snows, the snow melts where the tunnel remains. During the early 1900s, Charles Meeks, who later occupied the Heiss house, made an interesting discovery while working in the cellar. When he tapped on the stone walls of a sealed room, he noticed a hollow sound and found one of the large wall stones loose. When he removed it, the opening disclosed a secret room large enough to comfortably house 25 to 30 people. Another secret room was discovered in the attic. Daniel wrote on April 8, 1849,
Took a walk out to the east end of the Plank Walk. Came back in company with some movers going to Indiana. Arrived about 7:30 with 7 fugitive slaves by way of Underground Railroad from Wheeling, West Virginia. Welcome, welcome to the protection I can give with or without the law.
In 1908, a Salem News article documenting the additions to the house to be made by Mrs. William Silver also recounted the importance of the Daniel Howe Heiss family in the history of Salem. It reads in part,
During the strenuous days just preceding the rebellion, when the Underground Railroad was in operation, Daniel Howe Heiss and his home were the star of hope in the galaxy that lighted the fleeing slaves in their night journeying toward Canada after crossing the Ohio River in their flight from slavery toward freedom. Scores of runaway slaves found refuge and hiding in the cellar and attic under Daniel's welcoming roof.
John Brown's two-day siege at Harper's Ferry has gone down in history as the candle that lit the fuse to the Civil War. Daniel Heiss felt very strongly in favor of the raid of John Brown. However, he also expressed his great sadness for the lives that were lost there, most particularly a young man from this area by the name of Edwin Coppock. Daniel wrote on December 2nd, 1859,
Disagreeable day, and to me a melancholy one. Today, poor old John Brown of Kansas notoriety dies on the gallows at Charleston, Virginia. His crime, as they call it, was trying to liberate the slaves.
And on December 16th that same year,
4 more of the heroes of Harper's Ferry suffered death on the gallows. Green and Carpenter colored, Cook and Coppock white. The latter is a native of this place, born and raised a Quaker.
and on December 30th,
A few anti-slavery friends removed the remains of Edwin Coppock for the purpose of internment in the Salem Cemetery. Not less than 600 persons attended his funeral.
As a point of interest, Coppock was first buried December 18th at the Friends Burial Grounds in his hometown of Winona. The body was taken from the crude wooden coffin made for a Virginia criminal and laid out upon the lawn. The dark ridge around his neck left by the cruel hanging rope was still quite visible. Because of rumors that pro-slavery sympathizers planned to steal the coffin, guards armed with rifles watched over the grave. Meanwhile, a few miles north, the people in Salem were not content to leave a martyr to the abolitionist cause in a simple Quaker grave. They thought it best to remove Coppock's remains to Salem and exhumed his body for reburial on December 30th. Early in the morning of that day, people began flocking into town from every direction, filling the streets with thousands of strangers. The body, now in a new metallic coffin, lay in state in Salem's Old Town Hall for several hours. Coppock's grave at Hope Cemetery is 8 feet deep. The new, heavy metallic coffin was lowered onto a box of 2-inch oak planks, on which a 2-inch top piece was spiked and secured with irons. 6 inches of clay was thrown in on top of the box. 5 boulders weighing from 400 to 600 pounds were then lowered onto the grave. Dirt was thrown in mixed with rye straw to prevent it from being shoveled out. All of this was done in an effort to protect the grave from being robbed. 3 years passed when Daniel wrote this most poignant notation in his journal. He wrote on July 20th, 1862,
Got up at 5 o'clock, washed and put on a divine, clean shirt, and feel the better of it. Took a walk out as far as the cemetery, sat down at the foot of Edwin Coppock's grave, and soon fell asleep, and was awakened by the ringing of the church bells.
On February 19th, 1871,
Drew a design for a monument for Edwin Coppock, one of the heroes of Harper's Ferry.
4 years later, on March 4th, 1875,
Hauled Coppock's monument up to the cemetery, 3 pieces of it, all very large. The heaviest one weighing 4,700 pounds, but 2 horses hauled it on the stone boat.
in May of 1876, 17 years following Coppock's death, the monument was raised.
I laid out the letters of Edwin Coppock on the shield on the shaft. William Hinchcliffe will cut them tomorrow, and we will try to put it to its place.
The next day, Daniel recounts,
John Gordon and I raised Coppock's monument. We had 4 or 5 different ones to assist us. I borrowed tackle of the Buckeye, and without it we could not have raised it.
The closer I came to the end of Daniel's diary, the slower I read, because I knew the story ended with the death of my newfound friend. On Sunday, November 17, 1878, Daniel made a notation in his diary concerning the weather. He went about his business as usual that day and had been in town looking for George Lucas to have him go out and lay brick building a cistern on the Carey farm just west of town. Having accomplished his business, he started on foot to Unserhiem. About 3/4 of a mile out on the Franklin Road, he had reached the high point of ground near Unserhiem when he felt sick and leaned against a fence for support. Arth McMillan, son of his old friend Joel, chanced by and very nearly did not see him as it was raining quite hard. Daniel died in his arms. He never made it home to Unserhiem, nor did he finish that day's journal entry. 4 days later, Daniel's funeral took place at his beloved Unserhiem. Daniel's story is so much more than can be described here. His journals are an intense look into the lives of people in another century in a far different society. I felt like I lost a good friend when I finished reading those journals, but very much wanted to know about what happened to the people he so often wrote about. I continue to research for answers and would like to share with you the rest of the story. Daniel's beloved wife, Margaret, died 8 years following his death. She was 65 years old. Although sick for many years, she passed away quietly and without warning. Their daughter, Sis, died following a short illness in December of 1882. She was only 36 years old. She left behind her husband and 2 small sons, 3-year-old Edwin, nicknamed Bun, and baby George, not quite 2. At the request of Margaret, Mary Ann's husband Edwin continued the journal for an additional 4 years following Daniel's death. However, at the age of 37, Edwin also died, leaving behind those 2 small sons, now orphans. Edwin's sister Fanny moved to Unserhiem from West Liberty, Iowa, to help raise the boys. Sickly most of his life, Bun only lived to the tender age of 19, while George died in 1941 at the age of 61. Daniel's younger daughter, Nora, lived in West Liberty, Iowa for many years, running a large family-owned hotel named the Heiss House. Having never married, she returned to Salem, where she lived for 5 years with Dr. Della Walker and her old childhood friend, Alice McMillan. She died in 1955 in West Liberty, Iowa, at the age of 92. Their beloved Unserhiem changed hands numerous times following Daniel's passing, and as the 20th century progressed, it was eventually converted into 3 apartments, where numerous tenants came and went. Then one day, the house stood empty, seemingly vacated forever. By the summer of 1993, unoccupied and without heat for over a year, the house fell prey to crumbling plaster and warped floors. The roof was caving in and the wood siding deteriorating. Many of the windows and doors were broken out and the yard overgrown. During that lowest point in its glorious history, Daniel's beautiful old home, which once housed not only a happy, loving family, but countless beleaguered slaves on their journey north to freedom, now stood deserted and in ruins. No trespassing signs were eventually posted, and one day the order went out for the wrecking ball to take down the neighborhood eyesore. It literally came down to a matter of days before Unserhiem was to be torn down to the rich soil on which it had stood for over a century. In my heart, though, I feel Daniel's spirit still emanated to the very beams and foundation of that now eerily deserted home whose light was soon to be extinguished forever. The daunting task began to find a way to salvage Unserhiem at this, its weakest moment. Then on December 27, 1993, a headline in the Salem News heralded the good news that one of the city's most intriguing and historic homes would be spared the wrecking ball. This was achieved by the concerted efforts of many, including the Salem Historical Society, the Preservation Society, and Carolyn Caldwell. The tedious renovation was begun by Richard and Hope Tice, but it was through the efforts of many people that Unserhiem was bestowed the honor of being listed on the National Register of Historic Places a mere 5 years later. Today, Unserhiem still proudly stands high above Franklin Avenue. It is once again undergoing an extensive updating and renovations, being beautifully preserved by current owners John Zamora and Kevin Schaefer, and in whose capable hands its fate now lies.
Now we'll tell you about our emotional visit to see the journals in person and tracking down current members of the family. In late May of 2001, Judy and I traveled to the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus and had the privilege of seeing Daniel's actual journals. It was a very moving experience for both of us. As we leafed through all 6 of the now fragile books, it was interesting to see how he had doodled in the margins, jotted down recipes, had news clippings glued in, along with his actual sketches of the decorative cornice which still adorns Unserhiem. Through Judy's ongoing internet research, we were able to locate Daniel's great-great-grandson, attorney Daniel George Heiss, who practices law in Jackson, Mississippi. He was astonished to hear of our interest in his family and was unaware of the rich history of Unserhiem. Dan and Betty have 2 children, a daughter named Rivers and a son befittingly named Daniel. On March 21, 2001, Dan and his wife Betty Sims Heiss visited Salem, Ohio for the very first time. We spent the entire day with them touring the Salem Public Library, Unserhiem, the Salem Historical Society, Hope Cemetery, and the Trinity Block. We concluded their stay with a celebration at the Spread Eagle Tavern. In June of 2002, my wife Susan and I visited with Dan and Betty Heiss in their beautiful home in Jackson, Mississippi, and enjoyed their real Southern hospitality.
In 2003, Ohio's bicentennial brought with it the opportunity to compete for an Ohio historical marker to honor Daniel's wonderful old home. This opportunity was made possible through a matching grants program with the Ohio Bicentennial Commission in conjunction with the Longaberger Legacy Initiative. We did extensive research to include the required supportive documentation, most of which came directly from Daniel's journals and in his own words. We were thrilled to learn we were one of only 2 winners selected in the final round to be awarded an historical marker in this area of Ohio. And on a lovely spring afternoon in May of 2003, George and I had the distinct honor of presiding over the ceremonies held right on the front lawn of Unserhiem where the unveiling of the coveted Ohio Bicentennial's historical marker took place. The celebration was graciously hosted by the Salem Historical Society with nearly 100 people in attendance, including city officials and representatives of both the Ohio Historical Society and the Ohio Bicentennial Commission. It was a very poignant time for both George and I as we stood on the front porch of Unserhiem and presented our program using the words that Daniel himself penned in that very house so long ago. It was one of those moments in time we will not soon forget. Much to everyone's delight, Daniel's great-great-grandson, attorney Dan Heiss, once again journeyed up north from his home in faraway Dixie to represent the Heiss family on this special occasion. Dan remarked on the importance of Unserhiem to the Salem community and in the life of the Heiss family. He also spoke of his marriage to his wife Betty, who grew up in South Carolina, the great-great-granddaughter of a slaveholder. He said he did not think it accidental that there was a marriage of the daughter of a slave owner with the son of abolitionists, feeling they symbolized a healing process still going on. In his closing remarks, he so beautifully stated, "It's not so ironic after all that I'm married to a Southern girl and living happily in Mississippi. Is that not the logical outcome of what my great-great-grandparents fought for so hard for?" Dan concluded with these very moving words, "I have come home to Salem, to my ancestral home, to report to you in all certainty that the story had a happy ending." What started out as a special project assigned to me by George Hayes at Salem Public Library turned out to be something far more personal to both of us, as we both became immersed in the life of this remarkable man. Daniel lived to see slavery abolished during his lifetime, to see the village of Salem grow and to prosper, to enjoy walks in the twilight on many a spring evening, to raise a family. He lived a good and worthwhile life, a life filled with courage and integrity, and we are indebted to him beyond measure for the clear and honest picture recorded faithfully every day of his last 30 years. Daniel sometimes reread his entries that he made in those simple journals, and in closing, we would like to leave you with two final quotes. He wrote on February 18, 1877,
"Read old journal of 1849 and 1850 that carried the mind back to scenes that I would like to repeat, but they have gone never to return and must do the work allotted to me today."
This last quote was written on the back cover of his last journal. It was made even more poignant to us while we were in Columbus, as we were able to touch the actual journals and to see Daniel's faded handwriting in those worn, tattered books. It was made even more special to me personally when my daughter Christina had this quote engraved on her wedding cake. Daniel wrote, "Yet love will dream and faith will trust that somewhere, somehow, meet we must." That quote touched my soul and expressed my own very personal feelings about my friend Daniel Howe Heiss. Deep down, I truly do believe that somewhere, somehow, meet we must. Thank you.